in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
January 3rd, 2011. A little-known county executive is sworn in as the 45th governor of the state of Wisconsin. Immediately, he begins enacting an aggressively conservative agenda.
It is through frugality and moderation in government that we see freedom and prosperity for our people.
Within weeks, all hell breaks loose. By February, Wisconsin has become the primary front in America's ideological war between political left and right. How did this happen? Here, in the cradle of progressivism. After all, it wasn't just Walker sworn in on January 3rd. In the Republican tsunami that swept the country the previous November, Wisconsin experienced the most dramatic turnover in political power of any state in the Union. Democrats lost both houses of the state legislature, 2 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, a U.S. Senate seat, and the governorship to Republicans. And not just Republicans, but conservative Republicans. Setting the standard along with Walker was an obscure business executive named Ron Johnson. He too spoke the language of conservatism with a naturalness and clarity almost never heard from politicians. That language, it seems, resonated with voters in a big way. So, in a heretofore reliably blue state, where did these guys come from? Where did they learn to be so conversant in this highly engaging dialect of conservatism? Well, same place as this guy, and this guy, and this guy. Some of the leading figures in contemporary American conservatism and the conservative revolution of 2010. So, is it something in the water here in southeast Wisconsin? Or something in the air?
In the influence of talk radio, where the radio signal exists, we are represented by conservative Republicans. Whereas when you get out of the reach of talk radio in Wisconsin, the Republicans tend to be more moderate or even liberal with an R behind their name. So there's no doubt that talk radio has made southeastern Wisconsin more conservative.
You can't flip on a station in this town on the radio, on the AM dial, and find a liberal opinion. You know, the top 2 or 3 stations in Milwaukee broadcast a very conservative opinion and a perspective.
I am amazed at what a phenomena it is across the United States and in Wisconsin. It can certainly be said that some conservative talk radio show hosts have a lot of influence in, I think, shaping public opinion. Even in elections.
Going back years, in fact, to the beginning of the Rush Limbaugh program, or very recently to the Tea Party, notice what happened in Wisconsin. Talk radio was a very big part of that. You know, sure, we had an effect on the massiveness of the swing and building up momentum for the wave that hit Wisconsin.
I think conservative talk radio does have a disproportionate impact, particularly in terms of politics, because of the kind of people who listen to it.
The talk radio audience is politically energized. They vote.
When you see a guy like Scott Walker locally in a primary against a very, very well-funded and well-thought-of opponent, you know, be able to in essence win by landslide proportions based on a very, very conservative track record. I think those are the types of individuals that are supportive of those types of politicians who are also very, very strong talk radio listeners.
In general, politicians have realized that the talk radio can be a very, very powerful force. What I see from a lot of politicians, particularly conservative politicians, they know that conservative talk radio is the place to go because they're going to be able to get their message out without what they would define as an improper filter.
A conservative like Scott Walker, any conservative like that, will perceive themselves as having some degree of support in the media. People out there who are on their side and have a voice, who have a megaphone. And that makes a big difference.
You know, say, for example, the local news with Charlie Sykes, the local talk radio. I think it would be hard for them to go more than a week if somebody went through all his podcasts and go more than a week without Scott Walker showing up on there. I think Ron, it's almost to the point where every time I turn it on, oh, Ron Johnson's coming on. And it's like, well, doesn't this guy have a campaign outside of Milwaukee? You know, they're giving the conservative candidates a lot of free airtime.
In fact, Ron Johnson himself has publicly credited Milwaukee Conservative Talk Radio with not only inspiring him to run against Wisconsin Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, but with helping him to defeat Feingold. In a Wall Street Journal editorial, former Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan recounts how WTMJ's Charlie Sykes read one of Johnson's speeches on the air before anyone had ever heard of Johnson. Sykes' audience loved what they heard. "The reason I'm a U.S. Senator," Noonan quoted Johnson as saying, "is because Charlie Sykes did that." It seems conservative talk radio has had an impact on local, state, and national politics.
Well, yes, there's no question about it that we have, in part by letting the majority of Americans know they're not alone. That knowing that in fact there are other people who share their point of view is a huge thing. And I think that it has given conservatives an outlet. Conservatives who would often find themselves completely shut out of other media now know that they can go there now, which means that you have politicians who I think are more comfortable with speaking in overtly conservative terms, principled terms, when in the past they would have to cater to just special interests, or they would have to cater to the agenda of the mainstream media. You do have a shift, I think, as a result of that.
It tends to embolden, to encourage conservative candidates and activists. And that may in fact be more important than, you know, changing people's opinions. Another aspect is the mobilization aspect. Conservative talk radio can mobilize conservatives. Conservatives out there who would be conservative without conservative talk radio, but are mobilized by hearing that, oh, this or that race is important, or this or that candidate has taken a particular position.
And I think if we have got the first maybe major U.S. Senate candidate who was inspired to action by talk radio in Wisconsin, that's awesome. That's awesome. You know, we are a force for good. We're not a force for evil. We're a force for good. And the whole point of going on the air every day, besides trying to be entertaining, is to change things. And if we can get one person to get up and run for office, or organize a grassroots group, or run and win a U.S. Senate race, that's just absolutely fantastic. I'm proud to be part of something like that.
Now, in terms of impact on elections, I don't think, for example, that conservative talk radio caused the 1994 Republican landslide. I think that people were looking for an outlet for their anger at what was happening, like they are this year.
And here in Milwaukee, people are able to find a relatively robust offering of those outlets on the AM radio dial. Local conservative talkers Charlie Sykes and Jeff Wagner can be heard weekdays on News Radio AM 620 WTMJ. Overnights, the station carries syndicated conservative talker Laura Ingram and libertarian Dennis Miller. Milwaukee's News Talk 1130 WISN is dedicated almost exclusively to conservative talk. Weekdays, conservative talkers Jay Weber, Vicki McKenna, broadcasting in both Milwaukee and Madison, and Mark Belling provide the local voice, with syndicated programming consisting of national conservative powerhouses Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Mark Levin. While conservative talk radio is a successful format in cities across the United States, the abundance of local conservative talkers in Milwaukee is fairly unique.
Wisconsin, especially the Milwaukee area, has a concentration of some of the most talented talkers in the nation. I don't necessarily include myself in that list, but you have people who sit in for national shows And it's sort of like, you know, Dublin, Ireland, and their wealth of musicians that came out of that one city in Europe.
Well, we're a mid-sized market, and I think we have a pretty vibrant local talk radio scene. We have two big names, and I think in most markets you'll find there's one talk station, one very focused conservative talk station that'll have Limbaugh and Hannity, and usually one or maybe two local people, but one real name usually. So I think we have a healthier market here because of some of the peculiarities of radio in Milwaukee.
I think that this market has been blessed, or depending on your point of view, maybe cursed if you're somebody that doesn't like conservative talk radio. It's been blessed with a very, very wide stable of individuals who can actually get on the radio and take a thought and a point of view and be able to craft that into something that an audience wants to listen to. You know, Mark Belling, Jay Weber, Charlie Sykes, and WTMJ. I think those guys are all very, very talented. When you look at the scope of conservative talk radio talent at the local level across the nation, those guys all in one market it's fairly unusual.
We here in Wisconsin are blessed to have some of the best talkers in the nation right here in our city.
WISN Radio's Mark Belling is not only consistently one of the highest rated local talk hosts in America, he also guest hosts regularly on the nationally syndicated Rush Limbaugh Show, the most listened to radio program in the country. WTMJ Radio's Charlie Sykes is a best-selling author and nationally recognized columnist, has appeared on national television and lectured at major universities. Both Belling and Sykes are listed among Talkers Magazine's 250 most important radio talk show hosts. Is it unusual for a radio market the size of Milwaukee to have two local talents of this caliber?
Yeah, it is unusual. There's a couple other markets that have that. Cincinnati comes to mind as another one that's got some guys that are very, very good. But yeah, it's pretty unusual. I mean, Mark Belling's status as a Rush Limbaugh fill-in, you know, that speaks very, very loudly with regard to the analysis of his talent by some people that really know talent. And Charlie, you know, well-known author, national notoriety, he's made some appearances on TV. Yeah, I think that is fairly unusual.
Mark Belling is the voice. I mean, he controls afternoon radio. He beats WTMJ in the afternoon when they're doing a different kind of programming. And he really is the singular personality in Milwaukee radio. One of the best talents in Milwaukee radio, who's created his own persona. I mean, he does radio in a way that radio experts would have told you not to many years ago, including uses of silence. He also doesn't have particularly a good radio voice. I mean, he's got very nasal, high-pitched voice sometimes that's not very pleasant. But he also has a great sense of humor. He understands radio. He was a former radio news guy, and I think that he is at a level higher than almost all other talkers and sort of local talkers that I've heard around the country because of that.
Mark Belling's ratings are truly astounding when you get right down to it. I would argue that you can't really find many local talk show hosts on an AM radio station that dominate the key demographics in a market like Mark Belling does during his day part in Milwaukee.
And I remember the first time I heard Rush. I remember where I was driving when I heard that, and I'm like, wow, who is this guy? He's saying the same things I think, and I thought that he was going to be on more, but it was at 3 o'clock, so his show ended and Mark Belling came on. And then I'm like, well, who is this guy? It was this brand new experience. And actually I heard Charlie Sykes when he was subbing, and I heard Jeff Wagner when he was subbing in for Belling as well. So you had this whole little nucleus thing that was happening here in Wisconsin.
So what exactly spawned this nucleus thing? A quick look at the evolution of conservative talk radio in Milwaukee seems in order. In 1989, Steve Wexler, program director at WISN Radio at the time, hired Mark Belling out of WTDY in Madison to take over the WISN afternoon drive slot. Later that year, Belling recommended the station pick up an increasingly popular syndicated program hosted by a guy named Rush Limbaugh. Jerry Bott, then executive producer at WISN, agreed and decided to give the Limbaugh Show a try. Meanwhile, Belling assembled a panel of pundits for a Friday roundtable feature on his show. Among his panelists was author and former editor of Milwaukee Magazine, Charlie Sykes. In 1990, Bott decided to give Sykes a shot as a fill-in host for Belling. By 1992, Sykes had earned a regular slot in WISN's midday programming. Within a year, the station offered Sykes a contract. A superior offer from competitor talk station WTMJ, however, inspired Sykes to take his newly discovered talents there. In 1995, Belling tapped a new fill-in host, former federal prosecutor and 1994 Republican candidate for state attorney general, Jeff Wagner. At that same time, Bott added WISN news director Jay Weber to the station's roster of fill-in talents. In 1998, Weber was paired up with sports personality Bob Dolan and given the morning drive slot on WISN. Also in '98, with the offer of a Saturday morning show of his own and the opportunity to serve as substitute host for Charlie Sykes, Jeff Wagner joined WTMJ. By the end of that year, he was given his own weekday afternoon show. In 2005, with the departure of Bob Dolan, Jay Weber was given a solo spot as WISN's midday host. Over at WTMJ in 2006, conservative commentator and professional speaker James T. Harris was hired to host a weekend talk show. Finally, in 2007, Bott moved Weber to the morning drive slot at WISN and hired WIBA Madison's Vicki McKenna to take over the midday shift. Over the course of this evolution, two watershed events helped establish conservative talk radio as a force to be reckoned with across the country and in Milwaukee. Nationally, the 1994 Republican Revolution helped to demonstrate the format's ability to influence the debate and galvanize support. Locally, the Milwaukee County pension scandal did so to an even greater degree. In 2001, local blogger Bruce Murphy, now editor of Milwaukee Magazine, revealed that Milwaukee County officials had quietly approved exceedingly generous pension plans for themselves that would cost taxpayers millions of dollars. The firestorm of public reaction that resulted, fueled in no small part by Charlie Sykes, Jeff Wagner, and others, helped forge the bonds between Milwaukee conservative talk radio and citizen action, and presaged the nexus that would empower a similar but far more sweeping political upheaval nearly a decade later.
If you go back 10 years in this community, the Milwaukee County pension scandal. I mean, that's where I think from a local perspective, at least since I've been doing talk radio really came into its own locally, because you had this story that the mainstream media just wasn't covering.
I wrote about this originally and it died, went nowhere. Charlie Sykes did cover it a bit on talk radio, went nowhere. Nothing happened until we did a major feature story in Milwaukee Magazine, and that pushed the Journal Sentinel to start covering it. And all of a sudden you had this blitz of front page stories by the Journal Sentinel. Then that opened the way for talk radio, for TV news. Everybody was covering it. Did talk radio help to promote the issue? Yes, but the reality is what really mattered was the 800-pound gorilla, and that was the Journal Sentinel.
I think that the newspaper did actually some very good reporting eventually on that particular story, but I think with regard to bringing the sort of galvanizing the emotion of that particular situation, I think that talk radio did a very, very good job of that, and a very, very healthy thing to point out exactly what type of largesse was at stake in this regard. And really it was the wave that brought Scott Walker into office in terms of Milwaukee County government, a little bit of a sea change with regard to more of a dynamic tension between the executive side and the legislative side of county government.
Some people have likened it to dropping a nuclear weapon on Milwaukee County, because you understand the county executive went out, the county board chair, and 25% of the county board was recalled in the aftermath of that action. Ament never was recalled. The recall was called, but he resigned before election. It was the force of the action. I remember pundits saying it can't be done. We needed 72,000 signatures. We got 181,957 to be exact, in 28 days, which was much less than the time allowed by statute. And there were a number of factors that allowed that to happen, talk radio being one of the primary ones that helped keep the crowd enthused and got the message out.
Charlie and I started getting behind that, and I mean, I still remember those first couple rallies, you know, where you had just hundreds, if not thousands, of people that were turning up, and a lot of people were saying, hey, look, this isn't going to take off, but it did. But that was something that I think was was driven in large part by the fact that the talk radio audience kind of came together and said, wait, this isn't right.
So to have someone like Charlie Sykes, who was, really a godsend for us, actively backing it. He wasn't just talking on his show, he was showing up at rallies. He did a live remote at one of his rallies. So he helped energize the crowd, made it de rigueur for people to have petitions in their hands, something that people had never done before. And people like Charlie Sykes and talk radio helped make that happen to an extent we could never have achieved.
The experience seems to have prepared Wisconsin for a call to action that was to come 7 years later.
President Obama, are you listening?
After nearly a year and a half of economic turmoil and unprecedented government spending and expansion, discontent among a growing number of Americans was reaching critical mass.
We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
Tea Party demonstrations protesting the government's leftward lurch began taking place across the country. In Wisconsin, the synergy between conservative talk radio and the Tea Party resulted in that movement having near maximum impact.
We had set the stage for this kind of grassroots movement before. And so I think in Wisconsin it had a very natural fit, particularly because you also have hosts who tend to be a little more on the activist side.
I got tapped to do tea parties here in Wisconsin and in Arizona, where I have a radio show. So it was sort of a natural thing for me. The same things that I talk about on the radio, I could use and talk about at these Tea Party movements.
I was neck deep in the Tea Party. I mean, I was part of the crowd.
One of the reasons that the Tea Party movement is in effect and so effective right now, and one of the reasons that you have so much pressure from the GOP members nationally to move more conservative is because of talk radio. We were arguing during the 06 and 08 elections, the real message the voters are sending isn't be more moderate, be more liberal, it is get back to the conservative roots of the party. That the Republican Party has to move back to its more conservative tenets of smaller government, lower taxes, less intrusive government, and it turns out to be true. It's what America's screaming for now.
That sort of back to small government, basic U.S. governmental principles of limitations on government that the Tea Party has built itself around is reflective in conservative talk radio. As a matter of fact, that's been going on for quite some time.
Obviously, the Tea Party movement and conservative talk radio are very much on the same wavelength ideologically. Talk radio has certainly promoted the Tea Party movement. It gives Tea Party people a voice, essentially. Thus, Tea Parties generally would be much less well attended if it weren't for conservative talk radio. But those conservatives are out there, and talk radio has the role of mobilizing them. It simply lets people know there's a Tea Party. But by the way, I have to point out that the mainstream media have had a large mobilizing effect on the liberal union protest in Madison. If you know you're going to get covered, if you know people are going to pay attention to you, much more an incentive to go to Madison and hold up one of those signs, or go into the Capitol and start shouting shame, shame, right? Getting media exposure is simply a huge boon for anybody who wants to engage in any kind of political demonstration. And conservative talk radio has given that to Tea Party people.
I'm a weekend talk show host here. I fill in around the nation. And I'm telling you, the time that we're going through right now, it is a very powerful media to be a part of. And I think we're doing a great job of keeping the people informed and inspiring and motivating and compelling them to get involved.
Wisconsin was always a foregone conclusion if you could have looked into a crystal ball that our talk radio hosts were going to be part of this.
Following the Democrats' retaking of Congress in 2006 and the Obama Revolution of 2008, many proclaimed the end of the Reagan era, the death of conservatism, and proof, once and for all, that conservative talk radio was, in the end, of little if any consequence. 2 years later, the nation took one of the most pronounced political about-faces in its history, and Wisconsin voters endorsed conservative principles more comprehensively than ever before. So what's going on?
The cyclical toing and froing between a liberal philosophy and a conservative philosophy has been going on in this country for a long period of time. I think what you are seeing, however, given other new platforms of communication, cellular platforms, digital platforms, that sort of thing, you are seeing these swings in the pendulum become shorter and faster. When I say shorter, meaning shorter in terms of how far they'll swing a little bit left, then oh we can't go there, swing a little bit right. I think what talk radio does is add some velocity to that particular swing. Just the most recent election cycle, you saw a very charismatic figure in Barack Obama be able to sway a lot of people with oratory as much as anything else. As soon as a policy agenda was revealed, people began to understand the impact of that. Conservative talk radio certainly was the main entity to spell out what potentially that impact was, and you saw the velocity of the change from something that was becoming more leftist to a very definitive rightward swing go over a very, very short period of time. I mean, not even 2 years. It used to be that these political cycles were measured in decades. Back in the middle 20th century, you had after the 1950s, you had a progressive period of almost 30 years until Reagan came in. Now, a couple of years either way is how quickly it swings. I think talk radio has a lot to do with that. The question of are these relatively quick swings of the political pendulum, are they good or bad things? Entirely depends on your point of view, which way you think it ought to swing.
There's nothing wrong with motivating the citizenry to try to improve government. The problem is when the motivation is based on inaccurate information. I don't think people fully understand how radical the difference is between the way a traditional newspaper works and, say, talk radio. It's deep, deep, deep in the bones of a newspaper that it's all about objectivity, checking the facts, and fairness. That's totally different than talk radio. Talk radio, you'll often have Sykes or Belling foist some idea on people. It may be based on a suspicion. They're both good news junkies. They'll have some suspicion that this politician is doing such and such for such and such a reason, but they won't check.
They can say, again, really anything, today. And if it proves to be incorrect or it's completely wrong or it's misleading, there's no repercussion like that. Because they're not, they don't consider themselves journalists and they're not held to the same standards.
If they get caught up saying something wrong or inaccurate, hey, we're just entertainers. Well, what is it going to be? Are you a news source or are you an entertainment source? And they seem to keep shifting those goalposts back and forth.
I think they often present themselves more as sort of semi-reporters. And I think that's where it can be misleading for people.
They are misinforming people simply by the things they choose to leave out, by the particular slant that they take. But I understand that as part of their agenda. So I think their agenda is to inform people through a lot of misinformation, if that makes any sense.
It frequently intentionally misinforms. I'm not even sure they'd argue with that.
Well, I think the good thing is that it shines more light on politics. That's always good. The bad thing is that the light is often distorted.
Every proposal for any kind of tax change is always the largest tax increase in history. Any senator or congressman who's running in Wisconsin as a Democrat is the most liberal senator or the most liberal congressman in history.
I think when you use a conservative litmus test for how you communicate what you're going to talk about, it's inevitably going to result in distortions and in misinformation. A classic case is the case of the sewerage district. So for years you had Mark Belling and Charlie Sykes pounding the idea that the Metropolitan Sewerage District was a total failure, a total waste of taxpayer money. I mean, this is just egregiously inaccurate. Does it have problems? Yes, it does. Are there times where sewage is flushed into the lake? Yes. But it's a far more effective system than most cities in the country, and you would never know that if you listened only to Charlie Sykes and Mark Belling.
Talk radio is not just conservative, but it's extreme conservative. So it's more off, where the buses don't run, with the Tea Party and some of those goofy candidates than what used to be sort of mainstream Republican politics. So it's the extreme of an extreme, and it's kind of a world where everything else doesn't exist. That in fact you know, this is the way things really are. And if you stay in here and don't listen to anything else, you're not going to know very much because you're going to be out there on the edge.
What talk radio does is it helps the simple to defeat the complex. And that can be detrimental to a democracy. They simplify the issues at times in a way that's misleading, and that can very easily defeat the more complex argument that's harder to simplify.
Chris Liebenthal is a prolific local blogger known best by his pseudonym Capper and his blogs Cognitive Dissidence and Voila. Liebenthal is chair for AFSCME Local 645's political, legislative, and fundraising arm, People, and chair of Milwaukee County First. On his blogs, Liebenthal is highly critical of conservative politicians and media figures. Voila, in particular, is expressly committed to the monitoring of the local right-wing media and exposing their lies, hypocrisies, and foibles so that you don't have to. What motivates Liebenthal to do this?
Just to provide a source as a rebuttal to some of the misinformation and outright lies that were being spewed out by the talk radio hosts in Milwaukee. Just the pure hypocrisy of it all when, you know, I do work for Milwaukee County. And so when I hear them talking about some aspect of Milwaukee County or some aspect that I know from personal experience, and they're saying something totally blatantly false, it really gets my dander up, and the blog gives me a way to express that.
Dan Cody is a popular local blogger who is politically active within the Democratic Party. Currently, he is a candidate for Milwaukee County Supervisor. Among the many political topics Cody writes about on his blog, Left on the Lake, is what he calls responsibility-free right-wing talk radio.
You know, when I use the term responsibility-free right-wing talk radio or conservative talk radio, what I'm really talking about is the lack of accountability that they seem to perpetuate. You know, every day it's a different outrage, frankly, and there's always something that they're getting their listeners riled up about. And then, you know, whether it's completely true or not it doesn't matter. You know, the next day they'll move on to the next outrage or the next, you know, issue of the day. And there's no accountability to go back and say, you know, what about yesterday? What did we talk about yesterday, last week? Was there any truth to that, or was I wrong, or was I right?
It's no holds barred. Just be as provocative as possible, because that's all people are. It's entertainment. There is no penalty for being wrong on talk radio. If you get things wrong on talk radio, that's just more controversy and more listeners. There is no punishment for getting things wrong.
I don't think that there is a profession where there might be more public accountability than being a talk radio host. First of all, you've certainly got the laws. I mean, the defamation laws that apply, those types of things. So if you cross those lines, you're a target. Secondly, you've got the pressure that comes from being in a competitive economic environment. I mean, the reality is, if you end up crossing lines and being irresponsible on a regular sort of basis, you're going to have advertiser flight, and you're going to end up looking for a job. Third, you want to talk about a scrutinized media. Because there is a perception that talk radio is as effective as it is, you have sort of small groups of people who desperately need to get a life, but they're out there who record your shows, who listen to your shows, who try to parse different phrases that you use, trying to find stuff that they can use to discredit you. And I mean, that's fine. It's all part of the game. But this idea that there's no accountability, I mean, give me a break. I can't think of an industry where there is more focus and more pressure on a daily basis to get stuff right, because if you get stuff wrong, somebody's going to point it out, and at the end of the day, your credibility is what you have as a host.
But you've got to remember that you're looking for compelling talk radio. Now, if I just, read from a news article, or I go print off a CBO report and start reading it on the air, that's kind of dull. So you have to make it and present it in a way that is going to be entertaining. But in the end, if I say something on the air and it's a very large mistake, and I got to eat that mistake, That is not the most comfortable thing a radio person could possibly confront. And so obviously we want to make sure our credibility is going to be considered first.
There's no doubt that you get some misinformation sometimes on conservative talk radio. The problem with saying that is that you get some misinformation with some frequency in mainstream media outlets. You get misinformation in the New York Times and CBS.
Conservative talk radio, by and large, informs the public. It informs them. They can get one side of the story from mainstream media outlets or from NPR. They can get another side of a story from us. We're not living in a world anymore where you're going to pull anything over on anyone. You have the internet, which provides all sorts of forums and all sorts of opinions. You've got the mainstream media in the form of newspapers and radio and TV that do, and then you have conservative talk, which is one voice out of many.
Are they sometimes outrageous? Are they sometimes bellicose? Are they sometimes hyperbolic? Sure. But I can go to any campus in the United States of America and I can find PhDs being equally hyperbolic and bellicose and frankly outrageous, demeaning, pejorative. How many synonyms do you want? So to say that this is endemic purely to talk radio would be another great lie.
We're going to make it fun. We're going to make it entertaining. If we don't entertain, our listeners go away, our advertisers go away. But as far as presenting facts, information, data, I think we do a pretty decent job of presenting people with enough information where if they wanted to go off on their own and look it up for themselves, they would find that our interpretations are pretty accurate.
Whether you like the message or the ideology or not, it brings additional information. Now, that information is coded in an ideological and in a perhaps biased package, but there is nonetheless a perspective that you weren't getting elsewhere.
Nobody that I know of that's hosting talk radio programs claims to be some sort of journalist. They're commentators. They're offering information and taking a position on it and having the audience react to that position.
They're commentators, and there's no mysteriousness about their point of view. They come out and say what they are, so there should be no surprise there. They're not hosting, as I've said, they're not hosting a public forum. They're hosting a radio show where they're the star.
I would look at it like this. When somebody writes an editorial, they're writing an editorial. They're stating their opinion. That's what talk radio is.
My show is about my opinion. My bias is clear. I lay it out. If I'm supporting a candidate, I will say that.
We on talk radio have always said we're not journalists. We're making it clear. We have our biases. You know our biases. I tell the audience every day I'm conservative. They know we're coming from a point of view.
Now, it has to be based in fact, because if I'm just making stuff up and you do that on a regular basis, well, ultimately people aren't going to have any trust in you. Your credibility gets shot.
My objection is to the people who say, no, I have no opinion. I am objective. I am simply telling the truth. When, of course, they have biases as well, and their biases are apparent in the decisions about the stories they run and the stories they don't run, and how they play the stories. Look, if you just come right out and say, we're a bunch of lefty shills, I don't have any problem with that. I see that what we do is, I'm an opinion columnist on the air. If you have an opinion columnist in a newspaper, I don't have an objection to that. But it's when you pretend to be something different that I think that's the real big difference.
What's so frustrating to some of us in talk radio is that there are other people, predominantly in the print area, who really are opinion journalists as well, but they don't want to admit that.
And this is something that people who like the mainstream media landscape don't understand. The big check on misinformation is having a plurality of sources. They really ought to read John Stuart Mill. That's his argument for free speech. He's not arguing for an establishment media that is unbiased. He's arguing for different viewpoints being expressed.
I admit my biases. They deny theirs.
Another common criticism of conservative talk radio is that it's one-sided, presenting only half the story, while assuring listeners they are hearing the whole truth.
There's nothing wrong with making a persuasive case based on how you see the facts. The problem, again, is that there's really rarely is there anyone on the other side using facts from their perspective and from an opposite perspective to what they're presenting.
It surprises me to hear the right wing pretend like they're First Amendment kind of guys, because they're not. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in speech by anyone but them. And their argument is, you know, we can't have government telling us what to do because that's going to stifle free speech, when they're the ones stifling free speech. You know, they're the ones that are keeping other voices off the air, that are pretending there isn't even another side, that this is the truth and this is all you need to know.
They don't want to engage in that debate. They don't want to move this county and this state and this city forward. They want to increase the us versus them mentality.
The truth of the matter is, if you listen to conservative talk radio today, it sounds much more like government-controlled radio in some right-wing totalitarian country than what I think we should expect on the airwaves of a democracy, where we claim we do respect all opinions and that's how we arrive at, you know, sensible solutions going forward.
That's the typical thing that any news publication tries to do, is you get both sides to you really try to get the most provocative quotes you can from them. By contrast, talk radio, they get all this provocative stuff on one side, and very often there's very little coming from the other side. That's kind of just filtered out right at the front end. They're never even allowed to get on the show.
A better business plan for talk radio is more voices, is more diversity of opinion, not be out here on the extreme with only one, you know, one note kind of message that everyone knows what they're going to hear there, and a whole bunch of people know that they don't even have to tune in because it's not going to speak to them.
At issue here is an accurate understanding of the role of conservative talk radio in the realm of public debate. Is it supposed to serve as a moderator of that debate, or as an advocate for one side?
I understand the criticism of people who think that radio is somehow, or talk radio shows are somehow public forums for exchanging ideas. Well, they're not. They're shows that are driven by a host with a strong personality, with a strong point of view. The best shows are really built around the host, not around the topics that he talks about. And then secondly, the callers.
My mission isn't to be fair or be unbiased or try to make sure that both sides of the argument are represented. I'm the counterbalance for the other argument. The other argument can be seen every day in the mainstream media, in the newspapers that we're criticizing, on cable news stations that we're criticizing. So I'm the counterbalance to that. I don't feel the need to be fair and unbiased. I'm not fair and unbiased.
And I love it when the left, particularly the left media establishment, criticizes talk radio for presenting our opinions from one perspective. I can't imagine why you'd present your opinions from your one perspective of your opinion.
It's not a simple matter of changing people's opinions, but it is a matter of changing the general tone of discourse by broadening the universe to create a pluralistic media landscape.
The need that conservative talk radio meets, I believe, is just a counterpoint to what has been the mainstream media narrative. We have had traditionally in America gatekeepers that have been deciding what the public's going to hear and what it's not going to hear. Conservative talk radio provides that alternative outlet.
Conservative talk radio tends to level the playing field. And there's no doubt that conservative talk radio advantages conservatives on the whole. But the question is, does that unfairly tilt the playing field? Well, if you believe that an untilted playing field would be dominated by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, dominated by Wisconsin Public Radio, dominated by the news operations of the broadcast stations, then yeah, it tilts it, but that's a somewhat odd assumption. I'd say quite simply that conservative talk radio and other aspects of the conservative media, whether we're talking about Fox News or the Drudge Report or more recently the Daily Caller, do tend to add pluralism.
We own this venue, and the left owns it, and the middle owns it, and the right owns it, but right now the right is the only, party that's allowed on there, or are pretty much just dominant.
I just wish that the companies in control of these media outlets did give the progressive or liberal side or the left side of the argument a chance to get on their airwaves and try spreading that message.
It's hard for a lot of Democratic candidates or independent candidates to get their message out as effectively when they actually have to spend the money to do it. You know, with Charlie Sykes or Ron Johnson, you can almost always tell that as soon as something bad comes out, they're going to be on the air, or they're going to send him an email and he's going to read it on the air to the audience. That's one of my major criticisms. Is it seems a little unfair that they're getting all this airtime and all this. You know, basically, if you add Sykes' show to Jeff Wagner's show to Jay Weber's show to Mark Belling's show, they're getting 10, 12 hours a day of free advertisement. It's just providing an unfair balance, election-wise.
It's not as though liberal political figures lack a voice. It's not as though they have no way to get their message out. They certainly can get their message out in liberal newspapers. Certainly the broadcast TV newscasts are perfectly willing to talk to liberal political figures. Certainly public radio is willing to talk to political figures.
I think most of us would welcome the opportunity to have opposing candidates on. You know, during the summer, I was hosting debates at State Fair Park, for example. I invited Russ Feingold to come in. I contacted his campaign. I said, you can come in. I will give you at least 30 minutes of airtime. We'll be broadcasting just like I ended up giving Ron Johnson. Sit down in the studio, let's talk about the issues. I got a message back saying, well, we'll consider it, and then never heard again.
After a while, many guests that you are critical of decide they just don't want anything to do with talk radio or don't want anything to do with the show. I've gone after a number of people who refuse to appear on the show.
The reality is a lot of those liberal candidates want nothing to do with coming on and debating the issues with me in front of our audience.
If you want your message to get to the newspaper, to radio, go give it. I started with nothing. Right? There was no CRG 8 years ago. There was 12 people in a room. We had no money, no political power, and no infrastructure. I get a little worried of people complaining to me about you're not being fair. I'm not fair. I'm being conservative is what I'm being. You're being liberal. I think you're not fair. Gee.
I can't call into the Mark Belling show or to the Charlie Sykes show and say you're wrong, because I will never get past that call screener to confront the talk show host, because they don't want that talk show host being confronted or proving wrong on the air with facts. I've tried it, you know, several times, and I know a lot of other people in this town have tried it. I know the mayor has tried to call in when they're sitting there bashing him on their radio show. He'll try to call in, and the call screener just doesn't let it happen.
I've experienced this myself, both with Sykes and with Belling, where I have not been, I've called when they've got something going on that involves me perhaps tangentially, but whatever, that I have an opinion about this and it involves something that perhaps I've written or whatever, and at times I've not been allowed on to speak about it. So I know for a fact that they do screen calls.
Call selection is one of the key things in talk radio. Callers are the equivalent in talk radio to what songs are to music radio. And they're chosen in a well-run talk show to sort of fit the mood. The fact is that talk radio is not an open forum. Talk radio is an entertainment medium. And to make the show entertaining, the producers who pick those calls can be as artistic as the host in choosing the callers, knowing where the callers are going, and telling the callers not to say things like, as I told your screener, or long-time listener, first-time caller, or something like that, and just get to the meat of what they have to say. I think screening is incredibly important in radio.
There is a formula for a successful topic, and it would go that, you know, the host expresses a strong opinion. The first caller that comes up is a disagreeing caller, because that, in fact, gets the debate going. You actually want an intelligent, disagreeing caller. Now, again, I want to emphasize the intelligent.
Most of the time, our callers are gonna be along the same line of thinking. The folks who want to do battle, who are brave enough to do battle, and I mean brave enough. So they're brave enough, well, and they're arrogant enough to pick up that phone and dial that number. I can speak for at least four talk radio hosts in Wisconsin I know. Those guys get bumped to the top of the list. If you're brave enough to go, you're going to the top of the list.
Because I think it makes for better radio. Conflict makes for better radio than people calling in just saying, I agree, I agree, I agree. But over the years, yes, fewer callers calling in challenging hosts has just become a standard in conservative talk radio. And I think it's just because they realize I'm not going to win the argument. Not because we're so brilliant, but because it's our platform. You know, we control the button to dump them or keep them on the air, but also because we've prepped, we've done our homework. We have 3 arguments for the argument you're going to make, and after a while, you know, people don't like to be shamed publicly, even if it's somewhat anonymous, even if you're just Mark from New Berlin. If you're taking a beating on the air publicly, you do it once and then you decide, well, I didn't really like that experience.
They also get talking points from national Republican organizations, which has been, I think, documented in various reports. And they do get a certain access to right-wing media. I'm pretty sure they all get talking points from Rush Limbaugh for the day.
I think Charlie does regularly regularly spread the talking points of the Republican Party, and often uses those as a way to help plan his morning show.
What you're hearing from Charlie is something that the party wants out.
Ask establishment Republicans who have been criticized by talk radio, which happens all the time. Conservative talk radio has always been about being a conservative. To the extent that Republicans are the conservative party, we're going to agree on things. To the extent that the Republican Party sells out and forgets its values, talk radio will be its worst critic.
I think maybe, asking the Republican Party how happy they are with some of the things we've said about them, if they really think that we're regurgitating the talking points of the Republican Party.
Often, conservative talkers are in disagreement with the Republican Party nationally and locally.
During, for example, the Bush years, there were a lot of us talk show hosts, when we thought he was dead wrong, for example, with some of the spending things, we ended up calling him out.
I've been in this profession for 20 years. I've never been on any sort of Republican Party mailing list or conservative mailing list. Here are your talking points for the day. They don't exist. Now, will the Republican Party put out press releases and try to spin coverage? Sure, they'll do that. But there is no daily briefing that comes out from the Republican Party or the conservative organization saying, this is what we're going to talk about today, hit these bullet points.
They don't always agree, but for the most part, you can pretty much say if you listen to one, you listen to them all.
I think the people who say that are liberals for whom all conservatives sound alike because they don't really know what conservatives are. There are some hosts who are predominantly social conservative, some who are libertarian conservatives, some who are economic conservatives, and there's a variety of issues that we're going to come on different sides on. On the other hand, there is also just a commonality of principles and values, that if you come from the same tradition and you look at things through the same lens of smaller government, individual freedom, not trusting the nanny state, well then yes, you are going to respond to things in roughly the same way. It should not be a shock to people that most conservative hosts are going to oppose, releasing criminals onto the street. It shouldn't be a shock that most conservative hosts are going to be in favor of cracking down on voter fraud. It shouldn't be a shock that most conservative hosts think that people ought to be able to keep their own money. That's not a conspiracy, that's just shared values.
If you subscribe to an ideology, that helps inform the positions you're going to take on a variety of issues. If you're a small government guy, you're going to look at all of these issues, the issues of taxes or the issues of spending, in a small government way, and you're going to tend to come to similar conclusions.
But let's put all of us in Wisconsin in a room and let's all argue about gay marriage. Let's argue about open carry versus concealed carry. Let's argue about how we think we could reform the Milwaukee public school system. And I think you'd have Republican, libertarian, conservative, and constitutional, maybe even Democrat ideas being thrown about a room, and maybe a lot of talk radio hosts yelling at each other.
Right now, we're living in this golden age of resources and research. I mean, the problem is not coming up with enough stuff to do. It's whittling it down to what we can actually handle. I have a 3.5-hour show, and it is cramming 15 pounds into the 10-pound bag. I have a producer who starts about 4 o'clock in the morning, going through, I don't even know how many different websites that we look at. Some are newspapers, some are mainstream media, some are, websites like, the Huffington Post or Hot Air or the Drudge Report or even FARC or something like that. The audience also is a great source of information, sending emails, sending information that's going on.
I probably look at 25 different websites, newspapers, opinion websites. I do look at liberal blogs and liberal-leaning newspapers because you want to know what the other side is doing and thinking. You always want to be prepared in order to defend your argument. but I do about 6 hours of prep work for a 3-hour show.
I probably look at 15 to 20 different news sites on the internet with an emphasis on local stuff and Wisconsin stuff. I would say, though, about 20 to 30% of the program comes from listener-generated ideas. You know, listeners who are out there who saw things and, you know, want to report it.
Here in Milwaukee, I wouldn't say that the conservative talk radio engages in traditional hate speech, but there's a clear bias against certain segments of the population. Mark Belling is a good example. Now, I wouldn't call it hate speech, but a year or so ago, he referred to women who breastfeed as sows, which was just, it's revolting and it's disgusting, and it's just misogynistic. I mean, I could use 100 words to describe that.
I think that basically talk radio foments this idea that there's a conspiracy out there. There's a conspiracy of government, of academia, of the media, of latte-sipping elitists. These are all this group of people who are part of this conspiracy that are hurting us somehow.
You know, the homophobia is rampant. If you're gay, you're going to get called out. You're going to get, talked about on the radio. If you're a minority, you know, everything in this town, they'll come at you for the most part, just because you represent a minority opinion.
There is a certain level of sexism, homophobia, racism, or just plain class prejudice in a lot of these shows.
And you're certainly shutting out some of the growing parts of the metropolitan audience, African Americans and Latinos. You know, why would they want to turn on right-wing radio to, you know, be demonized?
Every day there's a new bad guy on conservative talk radio, and he's usually from Milwaukee. He's more often than not black.
You don't want to say anybody's hateful on purpose, but clearly, I mean, you know, they can't run away from the fact that, I mean, if you have a popular talk show host who basically calls Latino American, Hispanic Americans a hateful word, which, you know, a local talk show host in this community has done and got suspended for it, for using the word, that's hateful. You can't get away from that.
Mark Belling was suspended for a week because of his wetback comment.
In October of 2004, WISN's Mark Belling used the derogatory term wetback in reference to illegal immigrants potentially participating in the upcoming presidential elections. Shortly thereafter, leaders of Milwaukee's Latino community, most prominently local activist Robert Miranda, publicly demanded the permanent removal of Belling from the air. Protests were staged outside WISN studios. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel wrote numerous articles regarding the issue, including an editorial condemning Belling. Advertisers succumbed to pressure from protesters and canceled their contracts with WISN. And Democratic legislators sent a letter to WISN management demanding Belling be fired. Belling offered on-air apologies, though many of them in his characteristically irreverent fashion, as well as a written apology. Nonetheless, he was eventually taken off the air for a week.
Charlie Sykes made a comment about another Hispanic individual who sued him, and he ended up having to offer up an apology and a retraction.
Robert Miranda struck again in January 2005, filing a small claims suit against Charlie Sykes, alleging Sykes maligned, libeled, and slandered him in a November blog posting. Sykes had based his post on an email from a listener. When Miranda objected to its contents, Sykes researched the email further and found it contained factual errors. He removed the post from his blog and replaced it with a correction. Nonetheless, Miranda proceeded to sue Sykes for libel. Eventually, the suit was settled without a trial, with Sykes' employer, Journal Communications, paying $5,000, the maximum amount allowed in small claims court, to endow a college scholarship in journalism for students from South Division High School.
I think other talk show hosts have been criticized and even penalized for the way that they've talked about minorities in this community. One got fired for basically making a very, disrespectful comment in reference to a young black girl who had been killed in this community.
In May of 2007, local columnist Jessica McBride's new venture as a conservative talk radio host was cut short when she was fired from WTMJ Radio over a controversy involving Kane. 4-year-old Jasmine Owens had just been shot in the head while jumping rope in her own front yard, caught in the crossfire of a drive-by shooting. In response, McBride invited Eugene Kane onto her show to debate whether escalating violent crime in Milwaukee could now be deemed a crisis. Kane declined the invitation. McBride proceeded with the interview anyway, playing the sound effect of a chicken clucking in place of Kane's would-be responses, emphasizing her contention that local leaders were afraid to address the real causes of violence in Milwaukee's inner city. Some interpreted the segment as making light not of Kane, but of Jasmine's tragic death, and complained to WTMJ management. McBride was fired immediately.
What I notice is when you have conservative talk show hosts who cross the line, I think they are much more likely to be slapped down than, say, liberal talk show hosts or people in the print media who do the same thing.
I could turn on some of the lefty talkers, the now defunct Air America. I could turn on the Bob Show. I could turn on Keith Olbermann, and I can hear hateful things.
You damn right Dick Cheney's heart's a political football. We ought to rip it out and kick it around and stuff it back in him.
Now, Clarence Thomas has always kind of adopted the attitude of the House Negro, so perhaps he'll do it this time also.
So I can look at some of the left's comedians, and I can hear hateful things.
So, Michelle, slit your wrist. Go ahead. I mean, why not? Yeah, if you want to. I mean, or it's all a better thing. Move that knife up about 2 feet. You know what I mean? Start right at the collarbone.
Republicans are evil sons of bitches. The Republican Party needs to be murdered.
I marvel at the vulgarity and the vitriol and the misogyny that winds up in my inbox from men and women on the left. But it is tolerated, it is embraced, because apparently it's only sexist if you're insulting a liberal woman. But if you're insulting a conservative woman, you can say, I wish you'd get violently raped by 10 people, which is the substance of a mail I got once. And so what it does for us is it makes us understand there is no such thing as a voice for women on the left. There is no such thing as a political party on the left that is there to empower women. You do not empower women by wishing rape on them. It is not a way to fight sexism, to use every vulgar sexual reference you can think of to describe a woman you disagree with. I kind of wish I could show every woman who's wondering, which way to go. I wish I could show them my entire inbox, because it would be pretty hard for them to make a case that they were the party of tolerance, the ideology of tolerance, inclusion, and empowerment, if anybody just spent an hour reading my email.
It's the same thing with the hate mail that I get from black people. Some of the most vile stuff that I would never even could imagine, of saying things like this to somebody else. About my mom, people it just happened. Because you disagree with me politically? Are you kidding me? I face far more racism, opposition, backlash from the left side of the aisle than I ever have on the right.
I think one of the biggest concerns I have against or about conservative talk radio, one of the really negative things it does to Milwaukee is really polarize this city and this region. I always find it ironic that Mark Belling's tagline is "Standing Up for Milwaukee." If he was standing up for Milwaukee, which is has a high minority population, he wouldn't be ragging on things, and he wouldn't be belittling the issues that face the average person here in Milwaukee. He would be going after the big corporations, or he would be addressing issues like poverty or segregation or racial issues, or Milwaukee public schools poor teaching. But instead they choose to focus on the us versus them, which plays well into the folks who live out of the county, typically in the suburbs, and see themselves as fighting Milwaukee and trying to save Milwaukee from itself.
That's how they know they'll get the best spike in their listenership. Blame it on the black people.
They do incite anger in a lot of people. One of the running jokes on our blog on Walla is on Sunday mornings, his TV show, we keep saying they misspell it, the word insight. It should be INCITE. That's their bread and butter, basically.
they do it purposely, I think. I think conservative talk radio in this city, at least, does that purposely. They put out these societal problems as a way to blame black people as opposed to blaming people in power for not coming up with policies or programs to address that.
Now, when we're talking about, fixing and addressing the real problems here in the city and in the state and in the region, they've checked out, frankly. They're not interested in making this a better city or in making this a better place. What they're interested in is driving up those ratings and making more money for their companies. It's very easy for them to sit in their soundproof box and say, I'm standing up for Milwaukee. They don't do anything to advance this town. They don't do anything to advance this state. So to me, it's hypocrisy to say you stand up for Milwaukee or you're interested in making this a better city when all you're doing is working every day, 3 hours a day to tear it down.
Do they not want us to address any of those problems? How is the left doing on that? How are the racial industrial complex victim mongers doing on that? How are they doing on solving the problem of unwed pregnancies? How are they doing on the achievement gap? It gets bigger every year. The number of unwed pregnancies gets larger. And so I guess I'm going to ask them, would you like us to be part of the conversation because you don't seem to be doing too well on your own?
I would say in the final analysis, they are bringing up subjects from a conservative position that liberals simply won't talk about. I mean, do you want to talk about crime, up 36% violent crime? Do you really want to talk about the fourth highest poverty? By the way, we're on pace this year to pass Buffalo as number 3, trailing only Cleveland and Detroit. So the path is certainly wrong. Should we not be talking about these issues?
Mark Belling, Charlie Sykes, I locally, Rush to some extent, Hannity to some extent. We're not only offering criticisms, we're offering alternatives. We shouldn't be doing it this way, we should be doing it this way. Rather than doing this, we should be doing that. There's a better way to do this.
I always want a solution. Always. If I'm going to talk about something, I always try to offer up a solution. The left doesn't like any of our solutions because they tend toward moving away from big government, tax-funded, union-based policymaking. And they are more toward either trusting individual responsibility and choices or demanding it.
Locally, the conservative talkers have shown the folly of some of these public works projects and have stood up for the taxpayers in a way that no one else was standing up for them pre-talk radio.
I can tell you what the left is going to say for their ideas, though. Their solution is either regulate or tax, okay? Regulate or tax. You can count on that. And at least you're going to get some, you might disagree with us, but at least you're going to get some ideas on new ways to maybe solve problems, or maybe old ways to solve problems that folks forgot about.
It comes down to really philosophy. Do you believe that government creates jobs, that government creates prosperity, or do you believe that individuals do, that a free market would?
There's no doubt that conservative talk radio has produced more division in American politics because it's tended to mobilize conservatives, it's tended to give a voice to conservatives. And that means, among other things, there's more division and divisiveness. Battles that would have been fought, would not been fought before, because the conservative side had no voice, are now fought because the conservative side has a voice. It's quite simply the case that polarization is often a consequence of free speech. The anti-Vietnam War movement was highly polarizing. You not only had people saying outrageous and hateful things about the U.S. government, you had people on the other side who rather hated those commie hippies who were demonstrating against the war. The civil rights movement was polarizing. The abolition movement was hugely polarizing. So it's easy to be against polarization if it's people on the other side who haven't had a voice, and now they have a voice. You don't want to see that polarization.
We've experimented in a lot of northern states for the last 30 or 40 years, the Democrat model, and it has resulted in absolute, utter failure. So now it's time for, and the season is right for a new party to come in with fresh ideas. And the first thing that's happening is to get a hold of debt and to cut programs. And because there are so many people of color that are dependent upon these programs, it's easy to play that race card.
When you consistently claim that every criticism is based on some kind of bigotry, and that unfortunately is what I'm going to call it the racial industrial complex has been doing for years. You no longer have any voice in solutions to real problems.
If we're talking about the issue of poverty, and we're talking about the lack of jobs, and we're saying that part of it is because industry has left the city. And what we need to do is to get people back to work, and we need to get people to stop being dependent upon welfare or, dependent on large government. And you want to play the race card. I mean, it's just, You take away all the argument, and it becomes completely emotional. And that is one of the tactics that I find that exist on the left.
To the critics that call us racists, homophobes, sexists, xenophobes, they don't listen. It's obvious they don't listen to talk radio. You'll hear over and again that Rush Limbaugh's a hate monger, Glenn Beck is a Nazi. They're not listening to the programs.
For years, conservative radio talkers have been accused of hate speech.
I'm not sure I can ever think of an example where somebody on the air engaged in something that I would actually call, hate speech. Typically, that's understood to be, advocating harm or violence to one group of individuals or another, and I don't see that. I mean, that's this term that gets thrown around a lot of times because if you take a position, for example, where you're opposed to gay marriage, for example, then people say, oh, that means that you hate gays. Well, okay, no, it doesn't. It just means that you come down on this different type of issue.
Being against illegal immigration doesn't mean I don't like Hispanic people. It means I want meaningful enforcement of a sovereign border. I don't see a problem with wanting to have your border secured. Most people don't. Is it racist or is it ideology? Often, when I'm called a racist, it's because I struck a chord with a certain community that didn't like what I had to say. And they try to use it as a weapon to get me to shut up or back off.
People, particularly highly politicized people, tend to kind of go ballistic at simply hearing things that they disagree with. There's actually a social psychology term for that. It's called assimilation and contrast effects, where people far from you or me ideologically will tend to contrast them, will tend to see them as more extreme than they are. Thus, it's considered hate speech if you oppose affirmative action or oppose gay marriage. Why? Because we're talking about people who have a very narrow view and they believe that only a hater could possibly oppose the policies that they favor.
What is hate speech, man?
I guess I'm trying to figure out what they define as hate speech. I just figure everything that disagrees with their prevailing wisdom is hate speech. I was accused of engaging in hate speech once for saying that I thought abortion was immoral, and that was anti-woman hate speech. I don't understand how they define hate speech.
I think the left defines hate speech as anything against what they believe in. That's what hate speech is to them.
I think one of the things that happens is terms like hate speech get thrown around as a way to try to censor people.
What these folks want to do is they want to redefine ideas with which they disagree as hate speech, as a way of saying, shut up. They want to silence a significant part of this debate, and I think that's a dangerous thing. And I think, unfortunately, that's going to be the wedge that they'll try to use to bring in more government regulation.
An update on Reverend Al Sharpton's fight against Rush Limbaugh's racist rants, which are pretty well documented. Rev is trying to get the FCC to step in.
I think that we've got to have a standard across the board in government, how we use these airwaves, and I'm determined to make sure we have that standard.
The rationale for increased federal regulation of the media was perhaps best summarized by the progressive lobby and advocacy organization Common Cause in their 2008 paper, Media and Democracy in America Today, a reform plan for a new administration. We have an obligation and the authority to regulate the media, to encourage it to perform its constitutionally intended role. And we have limits on overregulation that would stifle the role of media. The trick is to find the right balance. The balance is out of kilter, and it is time to assert responsible regulation so that media can more effectively serve our democracy.
They just said that the First Amendment didn't matter. What they just said in that statement was, it is the government's interest to regulate the critique of the government. Now think about that. They're trying to give some sort of constitutional justification to erase the constitutional protections for media and speech, if that media and speech disagrees with the prevailing wisdom of the government. And they want the government to be the ones, the arbiters of that regulation. Need I explain why that's a problem?
Democracy is about free speech. There's a contradiction in saying that we as speakers in this society need to serve something. No, what we need to serve is a vigorous debate. What's happened, and what's ironic about this is that right now we have more points of view and a more vigorous debate in our democracy than we've ever had in history before. These Common Cause folks, where were there when there were 3 networks and somebody sitting in New York decided what was news and what wasn't, when the only way you would see an opinion would be if it was in the op-ed page of a newspaper, which might have been a monopoly newspaper? They weren't concerned then. Why did they suddenly become concerned about the state of democracy when suddenly these conservative voices pop up on these little tinny AM radios? Oh, this is terrible, you know?
It is simply because the left is frustrated that in one element of media, the voice of conservatism dominates. They were unable to quash it. They were unable to stifle it.
What I do about the media? Oh, God, I don't know. We have a strong First Amendment which has served us well in this country. You know, what I think I would do is, first I would bring back the fairness doctrine.
For many, many years, we operated under a fairness doctrine in this country. I think the country was well served. I think the public discussion was at a higher level and more intelligent in those days than it has become since.
What was the Fairness Doctrine, and why was it taken away? The Fairness Doctrine was enacted in 1949 by the Federal Communications Commission as an attempt to require the nation's radio and television stations to provide coverage of controversial news and public affairs, as well as provide a reasonable opportunity for the presentation of contrasting viewpoints on vitally important controversial issues. The belief at the time was that because there was only so much room on the publicly owned radio frequency spectrum over which radio and television content is broadcast, government needed to act as referee to ensure all voices could be heard on that spectrum. Over time, however, stations found that the hassle and expense of trying to meet FCC fairness requirements were too much and chose the more fiscally viable option of simply avoiding altogether any content that could be deemed controversial. The result was programming that served neither the public interest nor much of anything else. A development acknowledged by the Supreme Court in its 1969 Red Lion Broadcasting versus the FCC decision. If political editorials or personal attacks will trigger an obligation in broadcasters to afford the opportunity for expression to speakers who need not pay for time and whose viewpoints are unpalatable to licensees, then broadcasters will be irresistibly forced to self-censorship, and their coverage of controversial public issues will be eliminated, or at least rendered wholly ineffective. The FCC echoed this argument 16 years later while explaining its decision to do away with the Fairness Doctrine, stating, "We no longer believe that the Fairness Doctrine as a matter of policy serves the public interest. We find that the Fairness Doctrine in operation actually inhibits the presentation of controversial issues of public importance to the detriment of the public and in degradation of the editorial prerogative of broadcast journalists." As if to confirm the FCC statement, politically oriented programming exploded across the airwaves almost immediately upon the lifting of the Fairness Doctrine, most conspicuously on AM radio. In 1980, there were roughly 75 talk radio stations. Today, there are more than 1,400. To the dismay of the left, this astonishing popularity of political talk radio has occurred almost exclusively on the right. Of the nation's top 10 talk radio shows, for example, 6 are hosted by overt and ardent conservatives. Conservatives contend it is this popularity of conservative talk radio that motivates the left's efforts to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine or its regulatory equivalent through new rules such as broadcast localism, media diversity, and public value tests. Indeed, any one of these government regulations, if put in place, would almost assuredly destroy conservative talk radio as it exists today.
This is an issue that scares the bejesus out of Charlie Sykes and Mark Belling and others, because if you have the FCC come in and say that radio stations have to be even-handed and present both sides of an issue and that sort of thing, which used to be the case years ago, these stations will become, these programs would become boring as all get out. The fact is, even-handed isn't as interesting. It's much more interesting to rile people up and say the most provocative stuff, regardless of how true it is, and that would hurt their ratings and ultimately probably lower the salaries of Mark Belling and Charlie Sykes and all the other people who are in talk radio.
clearly it's to harass and harm the conservative wing of a pluralistic media landscape, while leaving alone liberals to be, for practical purposes, to be as biased as they want. But it's important to remember when you come down on AM radio, you're targeting a particular segment of the media, of public discourse. You're targeting that part that happens to be conservative. That is nothing more nor less than a campaign to try to silence conservative talk radio. And it basically shows really a fairly ugly authoritarian streak among liberals.
By and large, liberals tend to be more looking to government for solutions to questions that they have. Conservatives, by and large, don't. They look to the free market.
I think liberals and progressives tend to call for that intervention because the media, especially radio, and to a degree cable news, is so dominated by conservatives. So for those in this city especially, which is the majority of it is not conservative, that frustrates people. And they're like, why can't I find a different perspective on the radio? Why is one of the major news networks in this country so seriously to the right with Fox News? People find that frustrating. And so I think some people, on the left want to try to, again, intervene or have the government intervene on that.
Because their status. Because, I mean, in deep in the heart of a progressive is the desire that they want the government to enforce their will on other people. And that's one of the great challenges of our time. It is between people who think that there are answers in government and coercion and people who believe in freedom and markets. So it is not a paradox that progressives would like to have legislation to deal with free speech because they can't apparently win the argument, or they don't want to compete in the marketplace, so they want to bring in Big Brother. But that's kind of consistent for them.
I believe in the marketplace of ideas, and I think that talk radio is the dominant force in AM radio because there's an audience for it. I think there isn't an equal audience for liberal talk radio. Therefore, I don't see any need to police this. It's not some insidious plot.
It's successful. It makes money, it interests people, and it moves the needle sometimes when it comes to certain issues. We can't figure out a way to combat it, so let's use government to try to shut it down. Whereas, and quite frankly, I mean, I say bring those issues on, because every time you hear some of that, my response is, let's just let the free market work, and I think it tends to rally the base.
There's no elite that we can trust to decide that the market has failed here and needs to be supplanted by some government body deciding what the public interest is. It's dangerous for the government to decide what the public interest is when they, mandate flush toilets that use 1.5 gallons of water, or outlaw incandescent light bulbs. That's pretty bad. But it's even worse when a government tries to determine what ideas are in the public interest and what aren't. That, in fact, is the big difference between democracies and dictatorships.
I'm not sure that there's a role for government to come in and sort of be the arbiter of what's fair and balanced and what's not fair and balanced.
Surprisingly to some of my colleagues, I personally don't favor the fairness doctrine because I think that, I believe to a degree in the free market.
The airwaves ought to be open to almost just about anything, all different points of view, and even if it's speech that we don't particularly like or we think is offensive, that should be heard as well, and people can make a judgment themselves about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
No, I'm not a big fan of getting government involved in it. We've been able to do it without them for a while. So, and I mean, there are some restrictions. I think you need to tighten up on a lot of the hate speak and that kind of stuff. But as a First Amendment guy, even that, I see a value in having an all Ku Klux Klan station, because that would be interesting to show people who claim that, oh no, there's no racism anymore. There's an all KKK station. You could disprove that by having it on the air. So that's the way I think. I'm very much against government regulation of the media in any form.
No, I don't agree with a lot of what talk radio says. That's why I do what I do. But as far as regulation goes, anything like a fairness doctrine or anything, I don't think is the appropriate step.
The idea of various kinds of regulation to try to create more balance or more diversity always sounds good in principle, but it's often hard to carry out in a way that doesn't just result in making stuff more boring.
I don't like government regulation any more than anybody else does, and I certainly don't like it when it involves speech. But what I want to do is somehow encourage more speech, not less.
The public interest is best served by a pluralistic media landscape. The public interest would require really a freewheeling, wide-open discourse. Or as Jefferson said, error is not to be feared as long as truth is free to contest it. So instead of trying to decide what the public interest is, we should encourage a pluralistic media discourse where liberals and conservatives and people with idiosyncratic opinions, or even to a certain extent very extreme opinions, get to be heard.
What Rush Limbaugh has done and talk radio has done and the internet has helped do is broaden by a great degree the scope of things that people are paying attention to, the opinions that they have.
We now have the opportunity for liberals to be heard and conservatives to be heard. The last thing on earth we need is Big Brother to step in.
I think the whole country is stronger when you examine all ideas and you have an opportunity to hear all forms of speech and all ideas, and then it's up to the American people to decide what it is they're going to embrace, what it is they're not going to embrace, what it is they think is silly, what they think is legitimate. Society on its own separates the kooks and the wingnuts from serious debate and serious issues. By and large, before Rush Limbaugh and others came on the scene and started to challenge the normal media orthodoxy, there wasn't a whole lot of argument over bias. There wasn't a whole lot of thought by readers or viewers. Am I being influenced one way or another here? Is the reporter's influence showing through? Is the station's bias showing through? So if nothing else, conservative talk radio has really brought the whole notion of media bias to the fore. And all sorts of Americans now are hypersensitive to it when they never thought about it pre-Rush.
Well, I think media bias comes in two forms. First of all, a report that is just so one-sided, where they decide from the beginning, whether it's in TV or in radio or in print, that this is the conclusion we want to reach, and you write the story or you present the story with the idea that we're going to get to that particular conclusion. The more, I think, telling bias is the subtle bias as to what gets covered and what doesn't. In any newsroom, whether it's electronic or whether it's print, on a given day, they will have, the editors have a choice of 100 different stories that they can cover. And out of that 100, they winnow it down to 5 or 10 or however many they're going to cover in a day. A lot of the bias is what doesn't get covered. We don't like this particular story, or we don't think this story makes sense because we don't understand it, so we're not going to cover it at all. And that's the void, quite frankly, that I think talk radio fills.
When I talk about media bias, it's not that the editors sit on top and go, well, how can we kiss Tom Barrett's ass? How can we cover up for, Russ Feingold? Well, maybe they do. But what it's more of, it's the culture in the newsrooms. It is the lack of intellectual diversity in the newsrooms. It's the group think that takes place in the media that makes them all look at each other and go, well, doesn't everybody think like us? Don't we all think that people who are against abortion are nuts? Don't we all think that, people who believe in gun rights are a bunch of rednecks? I mean, do you even know anybody who, has these wacky, weird views?
It is reflected in what gets reported. It gets reflected in the spin. It gets reflected in the language used. For example, the flagship broadcast of ABC, CBS, and NBC are much more likely to label conservative political figures, ideas, policy proposals as conservative than they are to label liberal persons' ideas, proposals as liberal. And that's because they think conservative is something, well, just a little strange or odd. We've got to say this is conservative. But liberal stuff, well, that's not really liberal, that's just mainstream and sensible, etc.
It deals with prominence as much as anything else. What type of angle to a story is put forth as the key component of a story, in a TV newscast where that story is stacked in terms of where it runs in a newscast. The higher up in the newscast, the more prominence it receives. How much time is spent or space in print on a specific angle, and I think that's where you begin to see the bias, where the left-leaning points of view are given more prominence, given more time, are highlighted a little bit more. I think that's really the key component.
If you were to go through the newsroom at the Journal-Sentinel and put people under oath, 80 to 85% would acknowledge that they voted for Barack Obama over John McCain. That's just the reality that's there. Now, they can say, hey, we don't try to let that shape the coverage, but it does. The example I always give is again, the whole way pro-life and pro-choice debates get covered. In most newsrooms, 80 to 90% of the people are militantly pro-choice. They do not understand that a lot of people who are pro-life aren't these religious crazies. It's people who just view abortion as something that civilized society should not endorse. And so that's how stuff gets covered. I think by pointing that out, we end up holding their feet to the fire.
Two names, Woodward and Bernstein. Woodward and Bernstein created a big scandal. They created big headlines for themselves. They created great careers for themselves in breaking that story. And after Woodward and Bernstein, you had a whole generation of journalists, very wide-eyed journalists in that era, who thought we can change the world, we can change the country. And we can do so by exposing corruption in government, by going into journalism and participating in what's called advocacy journalism. These are no longer journalists that are just reporting the facts. These are journalists with a point of view, or journalists that are starting from a predisposed position or thesis and then going out to prove it.
I don't believe in the liberal media. I believe that if you read the media and you're reading it for bias, you're going to find it in every way.
I don't know what media bias is. I think every individual has their own biases, and so whatever they're bringing to watching a particular program or listening to a particular program, they're going to hear something different.
If it comes out against their candidate or against their political party or against their agenda, they scream bias. If it's something for their favorite candidate or for their agenda, well, that in a rare act of journalism, so it's just a matter of perception.
I think people doubt the media always. People doubt bad news. People don't like to hear bad news. When people talk about bias in the media, that tends to be a story that doesn't fit in with their worldview. Are there individual biased journalists? Of course.
I don't really think most people would think the media is liberal until they were told that by these right-wing folks who are trying to basically run away from certain truths themselves.
I think, the term liberal media bias is, it might have had some play with people back in the late 90s and the earlier part of this decade. But I think it's been so misproven that it's pretty much a joke to anyone outside of the very conservative, who doesn't lean extremely conservative anymore.
As a columnist, I was always accused of being a liberal, and then probably the late 90s or so, when email came in, I started getting a lot of liberals calling me a conservative. So I sometimes in the same column.
I'm sure if you do a survey of actual reporters and actual, the people themselves in their own personal opinion, I think they have come up and said, well, the reporters are liberal. See, that's a bias. But the editors, the owners, the publishers tend to be more conservative, and they're the ones that have to say so about what finally appears in their paper or on their TV news or on the radio. So I think there's more of a balance there.
You look at the people who do the news directing, or who are at the assignment desk, or who are the editors of the paper, or the publishers of the paper, the people who truly dictate the coverage that the paper or the TV station provides. By the most part, they're conservative.
The old saw was that the reporters tended to be more liberal and the higher-ups tended to be more conservative. And so you get some conflict and and perhaps they meet at the middle.
In fact, numerous surveys assessing the partisanship and ideology of reporters and editors from all sectors of journalism have been conducted by universities, research organizations, and media outlets since 1981. In virtually every instance, the majority of journalists placed well left of the American voting public in their preference of candidates and stances on major issues. In 2010, Gallup announced its findings that for the 4th year in a row, the majority of Americans, a record high 57%, said they have little or no trust in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. According to the survey, nearly half of Americans, 48%, said the media is too liberal. 1/3 said it was just about right, and only 15% said it is too conservative, with Democrats and liberals far more likely than other political and ideological groups to trust the media and to perceive no bias. These findings echo those from previous surveys over the years assessing public sentiment toward the media and its trustworthiness. And in the aftermath of the 2010 elections, high-profile instances of blatantly selective application of journalistic scrutiny only affirmed perceptions of a spuriously objective media that is more than just passively liberal, but actively hostile to that which it deems politically distasteful. For example, after providing a national platform for rank speculation that the Tucson massacre was the product of vitriolic right-wing rhetoric, major media outlets, for the most part, failed to provide that same platform for evidence to the contrary, offering instead only editorials and discussions about the need for a new tone and a more civil discourse in America. Meanwhile, in Madison, Wisconsin, daily physical harassment and explicit death threats being directed at Republican lawmakers received little to no national media attention and only scant local coverage, as did less than flattering accounts of the behavior of the state's pro-union demonstrators.
There are lots of narratives that have shifted over the last 4 months. I mean, last year you had cable lefties, Democrats talking about how the Tea Parties were racist. Just look at it. Where is diversity? This isn't a movement that looks like America. Now you look at all of these union movements, and I'm like, where's the diversity? This isn't a movement that looks like America. But notice you don't hear that. That's not being talked about by the Keith Olbermanns of the world. Oh, he's been fired. But you know, the narrative, the Tea Parties were supposed to be a movement of violence, and look at all of these Nazi signs, and look at all of this violent rhetoric. Now, especially in light of Tucson, we're supposed to be a new tone. Well, you look here in Madison, Wisconsin, what do you see? The very things that the left was complaining about, you see in the streets of Madison. You look at our state capitol, you look at the grounds and how they've been utterly destroyed. You look at the garbage, you look at what the desecration of our state capitol itself. Well, Sykes talked about it. And then the pictures are on Sykes' website. You did not see this on the mainstream media. You do not hear this commentary on the mainstream media. To them, it's a party that they're covering, but the peaceful protesters. But you don't hear about, from the mainstream media, what's being said, what's being done, the union thug tactics. These are things that I believe are not lost on many people, the hypocrisy, the double standard.
Lastly, in the minds of conservatives, the case that the traditional media is saturated with left-wing ideology is perhaps best made by acknowledging the well-entrenched elephant in the room, the failure of progressive talk radio.
I think one thing about conservative talk radio and why it's done really well is it has unearthed a group of individuals that have felt disenfranchised from the process. People that held conservative views, they had no place to express them. I might suggest to you that with regard to the progressive side of things, they've got the rest of the media expressing their point of view, and perhaps there isn't that drive. There's no sort of tribal instinct to band together and to focus on a progressive radio format because there's so many other places they can go to get that opinion.
The liberal market is already well served. Liberals do not need to go to AM radio to have their views. If you are a liberal, you are awash in a sea of liberal and progressive media voices. As long as we have public radio, ABC, NBC, CBS, Time, Newsweek, as such as it is, the Journal Sentinel, and papers like that, liberals are taken care of.
For us, if you're a conservative and you want to hear stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else, you got to go to the radio.
Skeptics of conservative charges of a biased, even corrupt media suggest that right-wingers are merely reacting to the alienation brought about by their own fixation on issues and events that are of little interest or importance to the general public.
They will talk about stuff the mainstream media doesn't, but the question is it really newsworthy, or is it just something that they can use to advance their political ideology?
They're just interested in the stories they find interesting, and even though they criticize the mainstream media all the time and even call it incompetent, for some reason they get awfully testy and even start whining when the mainstream media doesn't cover the stuff they think is important, which I think over time has proven that they're not really good at picking real newsworthy topics, because half of them end up either being false, like saying Russ Feingold faked the TV commercial and he really didn't, or claiming that Mayor Barrett had a secret meeting with Nancy Pelosi during a campaign stop in Milwaukee and that was fake. So I mean, they try to project as though we're the real journalists when they make as many mistakes as conventional journalism does.
When Sheriff David Clark comes on Charlie Sykes' show, he's there to push some Sheriff David Clark program, and Charlie's there as his mouthpiece. This is the same with Scott Walker. There's not any skepticism about anything that's said. I think there's informational value, and it's always important to hear people talk. The problem with interviews is that almost always those interviews are with people of like mind.
Charlie Sykes is often, and well, you won't see this in the Dead Tree paper, but you know, it could be that you don't see it because who really cares?
They've been harping, to use another recent example, on this the police radio system it's called Open Sky, and it just got instituted, and they spent a lot of time before it was even an issue talking about it and what a failure it was and how bad a boondoggle, quote unquote, it was, and what a waste of taxpayer money, how nobody wanted it, et cetera, et cetera. So when there was some problems with it recently, and their audience is well informed of the potential problems for it. Now, were all of them quite true? Well, I wouldn't say that, but they did spend a lot of time talking about an issue that really isn't that interesting.
That's been an issue that has been percolating for the last 3 or 4 years. Police, other members of the law enforcement community, and a lot of citizens have been saying that this system doesn't work, it's a waste of money, and the mainstream media has really been slow to the game with that.
Yesterday, 24 hours ago, you had the entire police radio system go down for half an hour, okay? So you have a story about the failure of this that this morning does not even mention the name of the mayor. The mayor of Milwaukee, who's presided over this fiasco for 6 years, is not even asked for a comment, but he's not even mentioned. So you don't hold the people responsible accountable. Now, by the time we're taping this, the mayor has 24 hours later is now scheduled a media thing, because I spent the entire morning hammering on him. Where's your leadership? Where's your responsibility? Where does the buck stop? But if you don't hold people accountable, well, then people are going to skate.
My father was a cop. I thought this was outrageous. The fact that the fire and the police can't talk in emergency situations, officer down was one of the complaints, couldn't get through. That is completely over-the-top outrageous that the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, for example, was not all over this story, much like they were all over the Ament recall. The Ament recall was just about money. This is about lives and public safety. And yet it remains hidden. 500 pages of complaints. 500 pages of complaints. Instances of gross incompetence, instances of public endangerment, and yet nothing. Why?
Some people would say it's because they're covering up for Tom Barrett. Other people would say, well, maybe it's just not that interesting a story. Okay, it's a big government expenditure. Who really cares? But that's one of the examples. When you lay out a front page, you lay out the front page trying to decide, okay, what's going to interest people the most. Now, I happen to think that the Open Sky story, for example, would be incredibly interesting, and it did get a little bit of coverage in the paper, but certainly not the play. How they end up playing stories, I think, is one of the things that does demonstrate that bias.
We have a mayor in the city who promised he was going to fix MMSD, was going to stop dumping crap into the lake. Since he became mayor, he's forgotten about that promise. He's dumped 8 billion gallons of poop into the lake. That is a public health concern. He has failed to fix this system for the radio. That's a public safety concern. Anytime you don't hold the politicians accountable, obviously the public's going to be affected. I mean, what is the point of the media except to be a watchdog on people in power?
Is the mainstream media doing its job in terms of keeping citizens informed in government, especially local government or state government? No.
There are these stories that are available with just a little bit of work. And I could I could bore you here for the next hour with all kinds of stories that we thought were of importance from a fiscally conservative perspective that never see the light of day.
As somebody that used to, cover City Hall on a regular basis, the amount of stuff that doesn't get covered now is kind of scary.
I think that you have a situation where there's a number of individuals that are doing conservative talk radio in Milwaukee who are some of the better reporters in this town. I think certainly Mark Belling is one of them. I think that Charlie Sykes breaks his share of stories. I think that Jay Weber and Vicki McKenna are both extraordinarily well connected.
And that's one of the reasons I think talk radio has been so successful, that we talk about stories that other people choose not to, in part I think because of the bias in the coverage.
I do think that the mainstream media downplay the importance of talk radio and conservative talk radio because they don't see that as having value. They don't see the town hall type of value that conservative talk radio provides. They just want to dismiss it as a bunch of, carping nonsense.
I think other media tends to try to marginalize talk radio, and radio in general, but certainly talk radio.
I think our competitors try to marginalize us. And I mean, for example, the newspaper is a competitor. The newspaper, I think, likes to view, okay, it says talk radio guys. I mean, they don't have any influence at all. We're the paper of record. We're all the information comes to. And they try to marginalize us. And quite frankly, you see what happens to newspaper circulation, not all of which is, of course, responsible for like talk radio or things like that, but the print media is dying. That's just the reality. And I think as it continues to die, they become even more desperate and try to marginalize us more.
I am genuinely puzzled at why there's not a greater effort to reach out to a huge segment of the audience that would be, for example, if I was the editor of the newspaper, which, God forbid I will never be, but the people who listen to my show are exactly the kind of people who ought to be subscribing to a newspaper. They're not the enemy. Okay, why would you listen to my show? Why would you listen to Belling's show? Because you are concerned about current affairs, things that are going on in your community, news items, and politics, right? That is the perfect profile of the sort of person that would be the type A circulation target who should have a newspaper. In fact, you could argue that in order to participate in conservative talk radio, you really ought to be so informed that you would read the paper every single day, right? So if you are the newspaper, why wouldn't you go out of the way to appeal to that group? Not necessarily exclusively, but at least show them respect. Here in this market, it's like, oh, talk radio. We have to show our disdain for the audience and the host as much as possible and pretend that they don't exist. And this is, from a business point of view, almost a classic case of irrationality, I think. Ideological blinkers make you behave in a, I would say, economically stupid way.
One of the things about talk radio is that it found an audience that wasn't being served. Nationally, Rush Limbaugh in the late 80s sort of created modern syndicated radio and modern conservative talk radio by reaching an audience that had nowhere to go. And it is basically, and this is to this day, the core audience of talk radio, conservative talk radio, is old, white, and male. It skews older than some traditional advertisers were like, and if you listen to Limbaugh, you'll find lots of commercials for itch powder and things like that. And it's that way with a now traditional talk radio station like WISN. They target a male audience, and broadly they're shooting for men 25 to 54, but really it skews to the upper end of that and beyond 54. And that's a part of the audience that's not served by much television, by much other radio, and that's a niche that I think radio can serve. And so it creates a group of people who are, I think, naturally more conservative as we get older, and I think men often are more conservative socially than women are. And these are generalizations, but the radio business is based on generalizations. And that has been the core of talk radio. It's the core of Fox News Channel, older, white, and male.
What they do have is a very committed base of followers who really want to tune in and really think that what they hear on the news, on the radio stations, on the talk shows, is something that's not being reported in their, quote unquote, mainstream or traditional media.
They do push this idea that their listeners are victims somehow of this conspiracy of liberal elitists. And the talk radio host is going to rescue them from that, because they're going to expose this conspiracy, and by exposing this conspiracy, they'll help to slay them.
If they're angry about taxes, or if they're upset about some major political thing, like when the Tom Heyman pension scandal broke out 10 years ago, you know, that is something that talk radio was really made for, and they could feed into that anger, get people stoked up and going.
Talk radio has a very simple formula. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Everybody who doesn't agree with us is an idiot. We're right, we've never been wrong, we will never be wrong, they're always wrong. It's a simplistic formula, and I sometimes feel sorry for the guys who are smarter than, I mean, Charlie Sykes is a smart guy, but he has to play this character on the radio because that's how talk radio works. Democrats are all bad. There are some bad Republicans, but Republicans are good, and the good Republicans have never been bad. It's very simple, and you have to you require an enemy, and you require an issue, and you always have to keep on the offensive. There's never a defensive, and you never apologize.
And then it comes down to, you know, what influence do they have on the population overall? Talk radio hosts, talk radio shows have an audience that, you know, a certain amount of them are the base, you know, that, you know, believe 100% or 90% of what comes out of Charlie Sykes' mouth or Mark Melling's mouth or any of the others. And they won't believe anything, no matter if it's opposed to that, regardless of what facts are presented to them.
However many conservative talk radio hosts, or talkers as we call them in the business, conservative talkers that we have in this market, there really are only two that count. Charlie Sykes and Mark Belling.
They would not have been on the air that long if they weren't very good entertainers, and they both are.
The other ones, they would all disappear if it wasn't for Charlie or Mark. You have to plug, you know, holes in programming, and you might as well, you know, as part of your branding on WTMJ, you throw Jeff Wagner in, on WISN and other slots you have to fill.
You have conservative talk show after conservative talk show after conservative talk show for the same reason you have Friday the 13th, part 13. You know, copying what has worked in the past over and over and over is something that, you know, kind of brainless media people do all the time.
I also think Milwaukee's unique because it's a very diverse and somewhat segregated area. A lot of people who live outside of the city, for example, just have a deep-rooted distrust of the city and a dislike of it, frankly. Talk radio plays into that.
This angry white men bit is kind of old and tired.
The people who live in Ozaukee County or Washington County or Waukesha County, they don't want to hear the positive stuff going in Milwaukee. They want to hear how bad it is because that reinforces, you know, their decision to move out of this county and to not support it.
Well, that's their, you know, that's their thing, that's their shtick, that's their hustle, because they realize for their audience, you beat up on black people. Over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been this growing sense that, you know, black people just complain too much, want too much, always make things racial. So they picked up on that, and, you know, regardless of the story or the issue, if they spin it that way, they're always guaranteed to get more, I'm sure, more listenership, more ratings. If they grab onto a meaty, sensitive racial issue and then take the position that the black people are wrong about this and black leaders are wrong, that's a very popular subject for them, because they'll get lots of calls from mainly white suburbanites who don't have anything to do with black people because there are no black people in their communities, and they feel a freedom to kind of express their, I guess, informed racial views that are informed by not being around any black people, and only they get it from the general media.
A closer look at the conservative talk radio audience is in order. According to Arbitron, the nation's leading media and marketing research firm for the radio industry, listeners to conservative talk radio are indeed largely old, white, and male. The news talk information format, which media analysts on the left and right identify as consisting of programming that is overwhelmingly conservative, is the clear favorite for adults 55 and older, second favorite for adults 45 and older, and third favorite for those over 35. 58% of those listeners are male, 42% female. And 90% of all News Talk listeners categorize themselves as other or non-black, non-Hispanic. Arbitron provides additional information as well. The News Talk radio audience is highly educated, with some 76% having attended or graduated from college. They are employed and well compensated, with 64% living in households earning $50,000 or more annually. At 83%, News Talk listeners have the highest rate of home ownership of any audience group measured. They are well above the norm for seeking additional news and information online, as well as for reading and writing blogs. And News Talk listeners are more likely than the general population to make time for volunteer work. In fact, in polls conducted by Gallup, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Talkers Magazine, and, most prominently, studies by Syracuse University professor of business and government policy, now president of the American Enterprise Institute, Arthur C. Brooks, conservatives emerged as significantly more generous than self-described liberals in donating their time and money and blood to religious and secular charities and organizations. And in analyses of American civic knowledge and engagement, conservatives, particularly News Talk radio listeners, consistently rank as the most or among the most knowledgeable and engaged, most tuned in to multiple sources of information, most likely to contact elected officials, and most likely to vote. All told, it seems unlikely this demographic is sufficiently gullible to accept the wanton fabrications of bigoted shock jocks. Nor does it seem plausible they would have the inclination to invest their time listening to hateful, racist misinformation. What is it then these listeners to conservative talk radio are tuning in for?
I think that people tune in to hear things from a different point of view. They want to hear the other side of the story. So, you know, what I have said is don't ever underestimate the common sense of the listeners, but they may not have all the information. But also, these are not, as Rush Limbaugh says, mind-numb robots. You know, people are actually very thoughtful. They really do care about these things.
Yes, they really believe in lower taxes. Yes, they really believe in less government spending. Yes, they really believe in reining in the unions. So talk radio conservatism is really simply principled conservatism.
This notion that conservatives are dumb seems to have become ingrained on the part of the left, particularly the academic left. And I think that what's happening right now is that people are revolting against that kind of elitist contempt. But the notion that the audience doesn't know what we're talking about, if you think that, then you will never understand why conservative talk radio is a success or why it's a force.
I don't believe that conservative talk radio has grown because it's hateful. I don't believe that listeners to talk radio tolerate hate speech.
We analyze a situation and we say, all right, it's your own damn fault this happened. You let these bozos run roughshod over our Constitution for decades. Now do something about it. And that isn't, I mean, that's a much more empowering message than, you know, it's all the military-industrial complex's fault, or it's all the, you know, the business's fault, capitalism's fault, your mother's fault, your neighbor's fault. You know, I mean, big oil's fault. It gets, what conservative talk radio does is it means to motivate people.
Our listeners make politicians' phones ring.
Conservative talk radio makes money. That's why it's on the air, and it's the one thing that no one really wants to acknowledge in the mainstream media or the liberals. They don't want to acknowledge conservative talk radio is about making money. My parent company, Clear Channel, wouldn't have conservative talk stations if they didn't make money. If liberal talk made money, they'd have liberal stations. Liberal stations would prosper. This really is a business.
Matter of fact, it is one of the most competitive businesses around. And the simple situation is, if there was a perceived need for a liberal station in every market, I guarantee you the program directors would have liberal stations in every market. The reality is that hasn't worked. It's failed for a variety of reasons. So what you have is in AM radio, at least, and FM to a lesser extent, what you have is a reflection of the marketplace.
And I understand that my bosses do not put me on the air because they think I'm a pretty face, or because they like me, or even because they agree with me. It's because that's what works in the marketplace. That's what audiences want.
In the end, you're going to be measured by the advertisers. And the advertisers are measuring their commitment to you by the people.
In part, I think the conservative argument is so strong and talk radio is so strong because it's just right. I do think so much of the conservative argument is common sense. It's also so American. We've somehow divided very American values into progressive or liberal versus, conservative. The conservative ideas of lower taxes, smaller government, less intrusive government, those are really American ideals, I think. Those are still things that most Americans want. Most Americans still want to be able to pursue happiness rather than have it handed to them. So I do think in so many ways the conservative argument is the common sense argument, and that's what people are responding to.